Okay, so let's talk about poses. I'm going to plug this website since I'm going to use their image, and so grab that quickly and just go straight to that image. So what is a pose? It's just an arrangement of shapes, form, in particular with a character if you're animating characters. And here this person is showing arcs of motion in animating and setting up poses. But it's basically for what we want to know is we're just basically pointing out the fact that a pose is just an arrangement, a shape, a form that you create with the items in the scene. Then that's all that a pose is. So if we go over to the 3D world, go back here to object mode, okay, we have a armature, right? And we have the scene and the timeline, and we have, if we're in the animation preset, we can see the dope sheet and the graph editor and the timeline down here. And so we are immediately starting to think in terms of animating over time, right? And over here, if you click on the armature tab and go down here under bone groups, or below bone groups I should say, and under the pose library is where we can manage our poses over here, and we can also manage them with keyboard shortcuts and other things. Alright, but now I mostly want to point out that, so there's all the technical stuff over here, right? But we're not really straying too far from the definition of what a pose is. And it has nothing to do with keyframes or any of the technical stuff. A pose is just a position, an arrangement of these items to create this shape. That's what a pose is. And if you keep that fundamental understanding, it'll help you understand poses in 3D a lot better. So let me show you what I mean by that. So let's start from the very beginning. Notice that if you're in the outliner and you click on armature here, that's the object level, so we're down in object mode. And under the object level, the next level under that would be the edit mode level, and under here you can see these bones where we've named them, right? And under that is a pose level. And so in the pose level, now we have the bones as pose items, and you see it changed automatically from edit mode, went from object mode to edit mode to pose mode. Okay, so in pose mode is where we are animating and creating poses. Okay, and so now if you notice, if we go back to object mode here and I try to make a pose here, I can't do it because I'm not in pose mode, right? So now I can add a pose, and you can also now access the pose menu, and you can go to pose library, add a pose, and so on and so forth. When you add one pose, it's going to create a new pose library. But before I get there, I want to illustrate what a pose actually is in 3D. And all that it is, if I am here in individual origins, I can just rotate this like that, and that is a pose. So before you start asking a bunch of questions like, well, wait a minute, we're not really animating, I don't have any keyframes, I don't have an action even yet, and my dope sheet is not got any keyframes, my graph editor doesn't have any keyframes, and the answer to that is because none of that stuff has anything to do with poses. This is a pose. That's what a pose is. It's not an action, it's not animation, it's not keyframes, it's just a position of these items in the scene. And believe me, this is going to make a lot of sense in a few minutes. So let's go back over here. What's a pose? It's just an arrangement of items or shapes, or you're drawing these positions, right, to convey something, convey some emotion, action, motion, so on and so forth. Okay, so now we come back over here, and that's exactly what we have. So let's clear that out. So what have I done here? I've created the look of grass blowing over in the wind. That's a pose. It's a pose that shows me grass blowing over in the wind. Okay, so if someone was to ask you what is a pose, well, the answer would be, well, it's just an arrangement, a position, and a motion. A motion, not emotion, although it could show emotion and it could indicate motion. in this case, if you're just a still image, there you go. You got a pose showing grass being blown over in the wind, or whatever, right? So it's clear. It's good to keep a clear understanding of what an actual pose is, that we're not talking about actions or anything else at this point. So now let's clear it out. So, just for the sake of illustration, let's create, I'm going to go back here, let's see, we're on frame 1. Okay, now let's just create some keyframes on all these bones right at the same time, and we're just going to create keyframes on rotation for now. Okay, so now everything lights up. I've got a dope sheet come alive. I've got my graph editor. If I switch this over to the action editor, now it shows me my actions. Down here I can choose an action, I can rename it, and so on and so forth, right? Or I can delete it, add a new one, and so on. Okay, and I can also duplicate it. Let's see, why is it not letting me duplicate it? That I'm not sure just yet. But I know it's possible. So, now, moving on, now we've got animation here. So, now I'm going to move to this part of the timeline, and now I'm going to create my pose again. So, now I'm going to rotate my grass moving in the wind. There we go. So now I've created a pose. Except I also have a problem, because now that I move the timeline, it snaps back to this keyframe. Why? Because I haven't stored the pose anywhere. I can't really emphasize how important it is to tell the difference between creating a pose and setting keyframes to store the pose in the current action that you're editing, right? Okay, so now we've got straight to here, right? We've got two poses. We got the rest pose, and then we've got the grass blowing in the wind pose. Okay, so now let's switch this back over to the dope sheet and expand that up a little bit. And let's take this and let's just duplicate it. Excuse me. And so now we have our rest pose to the grass blowing in the wind pose, back to the rest pose again. Alright, so now, suppose I don't want to animate this every time to get to that pose, right? And I want to just simply have that pose to put in here anytime I want to put it in. Alright, so now to do that, I'm going to go to the pose library. This time I'll just do it manually to show it here. And I'll say new, and then go over here and hit the plus sign. Let's keep that at pose lab for now. We'll go hit the plus sign, add new, and so now we have a rest pose. Okay, so now let's go and add another one. It's the first, yeah, let me just animate it first. So now I'll, or pose it first, I should say, and I'm going to pose it. No keyframes, remember. There's no keyframes here. And then I'm going to add a new one. Add new current frame, that'll work. Okay, and then let's just call this grass. Okay, so now it snaps back again. So I've got this pose, and they are not at all related to the action that I'm animating in right now. Okay, so now let's go back here, and let's apply the grass pose right here. So with this grass one selected, I'll click on this little icon right here, and it will now create a pose. So now here's where I'm trying to illustrate. Notice how no keyframes happened. No keyframes occurred. It's no, but because if I start to move the timeline, it's going to pop away. So it's no different than me just doing this, right? So what's a pose? A pose is just a position. That's all, right? So now you've added a pose to your scene, but you haven't done anything to store it or to animate with it. You've just simply added that pose to your scene. Now you must hit the rotation, record the rotation frames, keys for that frame, right? And so now we have the grass blowing again, right? So we got that grass blowing, right? And so we can just kind of keep going. We can just go here. Let's put that in there. keyframes, we could, you know, have automatic keyframes on to make it go faster, but just to illustrate this, and again, let's put the grass blowing and then add the keyframes and so on, right? So now, that's how we're using the pose library. So now, how is a pose library storing its information? And the answer to that is right here. You see where it says pose lib. So if you go here to your dope sheet, change it over to Action Editor, and change this to pose lib, and now you can see it's got these two poses in it. Right? It's got this pose and that pose. And as I move down the timeline, I can just switch between these two poses. Okay? And so that's really all that it is. It's just a place to store those. Alright? And it works more or less in the background. And then we go back to the armature action here, and now the number shows up. I'm not sure why it didn't show up with one keyframe. It's a little bit of a mystery to me. But see, just to go back to what I said before, you can duplicate these. Just hit that once. And now I can name this my grass 1. Right? So I've got the original that I made and grass 1. They're both the same. Alright? So that's just a way to manage actions. One of the ways there. So mostly wanted to illustrate what a pose was, right? And the difference between that and an action and keyframes and all that kind of stuff, right? Pretty simple. Of course, there's a lot of options here. There's if you look at the pose library, there's copy pose, paste a flipped pose. So if you want to, you know, have poses matching on left and right, and so on. And you know, create more poses. You can create more libraries, right? So there's a lot of stuff to study here. I just wanted to really cover the fundamental basics of what a pose is, so you're not confused, and you can move on and study this stuff. All right.